Question 2, how and why has suffrage been expanded in the United States? Why has the expansion of suffrage been controversial? How have advocates of extended suffrage used their rights under the First Amendment to achieve their goals? But really,
in the words of Congressman John Lewis, your vote is precious, almost sacred. It is the most important nonviolent tool we have to make a difference. The United States has, since its founding, placed a great deal of importance on the citizen's right to vote.
However, this right was never fully extended to all American citizens. As a natural response to this, minority groups throughout American history have come together and utilized their First Amendment rights to progress their standings and ultimately gain suffrage.
The prevailing idea on suffrage in classical thought was that to vote, citizens must have an economic stake in the community. These individuals were believed to be the most likely to cast informed votes and avoid the rule of the masses that the philosopher Plato and many of the founders feared so much. This idea carried over to American colonial society, where voting rights were again given exclusively to property owners. However, due to the remarkable affordability of American land, the number of eligible voters actually increased.
The debate over suffrage proved particularly divisive during the Philadelphia Convention, and as a result, voting was mentioned only twice in the Constitution, in Article 1 regarding the election of representatives, and in the Electoral College enumerated in Article 2. Under the new Constitution, Native Americans had a status comparable to that of a foreign nation. This made Native American suffrage rights incredibly controversial. A similar situation is found in the modern debate over suffrage rights for legal immigrants and resident aliens. Like the Native Americans before them, these resident suffrage rights are constantly being questioned due to their possible standing as foreign nationals, and their protection under the Constitution is still uncertain.
Following the Civil War, voting rights of African Americans were also ill-defined by the Constitution. Despite winning freedom, citizenship, and the right to vote through the Reconstruction Amendments, African Americans still had noticeably little voter participation, due largely to Jim Crow laws which inhibited the right to suffrage for African Americans. This practice was allowed to continue because of the views on where the power to vote was derived from. Most states still saw it as their right to deny or allow the vote. This issue was at the heart of controversy because of the lack of consensus in states' opinions on voting rights. This debate has even continued today. The issue of voter ID laws in states such as Pennsylvania and Alabama provide multiple similarities to the literacy tests.
It would take a century before African Americans finally won the right to vote freely with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which banned such tests in any state or political subdivision, and further enforced the 15th Amendment. This came about due in large part to resistance, such as sit-ins, nonviolent protests, and church meetings, which were protected under the First Amendment rights to speak, assemble, and petition the government freely. The ability to assemble freely proved vital to the African American push for suffrage, as well as the later women's suffrage movement. A clear demonstration of this occurred at the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, when suffragists rallied behind leaders such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, and penned a declaration that held all men and women are created equal. This paved the way for the tsunami of suffragists that would flood the political scene 70 years later.
In the early 20th century, as the progressive movement gained popularity, women again stormed the political scene. Gaining momentum from the disappointing ruling in Minor v. Happersett, suffrage leaders actively lobbied the new, more progressive administrations. In addition, as the nation prepared to enter World War I, the lack of women's suffrage made the plea for universal democracy far less legitimate. In the words of famed suffragist Alice Paul, "We women tell you that America is not a democracy, not when 20 million women are denied the right to vote." The continuous petitioning and lobbying of the suffragists, coupled with the American love of democracy, ultimately resulted in the creation of another right, the woman's right to vote.
Since 1978, the state of Nevada has included an option on the ballot that allows voters to cast a ballot in favor of none of the above. The intent behind this measure was to expand the vote as a means of expression to encompass the right not to vote for any candidate, demonstrating how this precious right has evolved consistently throughout American history. Whether these changes have occurred to correct the mistakes of the past or simply to allow the disenfranchised to have a voice, the expansion of suffrage is yet another aspect of the perpetual journey to work to form a more perfect union. Thank you.
Mr. Crown came up with this great idea. He came to me and said, voting in this country should be mandatory. And if you don't vote, you should be fined. And all those fines collected from everyone that doesn't vote should go directly to support the National We the People program. What do you think about that idea of mandatory voting?
Well, I'd say that that system, which is very comparable to the Australian system of going about this whole thing, would create a society where we didn't have that option not to vote, as we said in that conclusion. That is a very important part of that right.
Part of our right to speak also includes the right to be silent. And what we have to look at is that should we make the, voting a requirement, although we could, I'm sure, use the funding, it would ultimately just take away a means of our expression. And that's something that we as Americans have to avoid.
I definitely disagree with the whole compulsory system and everything, because if you make everybody vote, that just calls for more uninformed voting, and to me, uninformed voting is not a good thing.
If everyone is forced to vote, then what about those who do not choose for either candidate? Then we would have to put the none of the above option on all the ballots, and that would change the, everyone's voting, and that would still allow everyone to voice their opinion, though.
Aren't people not voting because they're just lazy?
Absolutely not. There's tons of different reasons why people will not vote. The voter ID laws, for example, made it incredibly difficult for people to get out and vote, especially if they were from a lower socioeconomic bracket.
I also wouldn't describe laziness as a particular. I'd just say to the amount that our market's been diluted by the political ads and that kind of thing, people are just sick of it. So I'd say that having these civics classes like this one kind of tell people, well, this is why this is happening, this is why we need you to vote. And if we keep them informed in that way, then we won't have to have that type of thing.
I'd have to agree with my colleague that some people might be sick of it because of all the phone calls they get during election season, or the negative campaign ads that they get on TV. So why would they want to vote when all this is going on, when all this negative atmosphere that is put around them during the voting season?
Colonel Merritt was talking to me the other day, and he said something about Argentina had just extended the right to vote to 16-year-olds. Remember saying that?
Yeah, I did.
They extended the right to vote to 16-year-olds, and they also got rid of their compulsory voting. What do you guys think about that?
Well, in Oregon v. Mitchell, it was decided that 18-year-olds, that would be the cutoff. And I'd say that I'd have to agree with that case, because honestly, a 16-year-old who is a sophomore in high school voting scares me. They haven't, they can't drive yet.
Driving.
Yeah. I would say that that would not be a good idea.
I'd have to agree with John because, like I said before, lack of education. Thinking back to my sophomore year, for me to be able to vote, I wouldn't even know what to do. And also along with that, we take government as a senior. So if education was switched around to maybe being more informed and have government maybe as a freshman and as a sophomore, then I think we would have more informed voting if the vote was extended to 16-year-olds.
The anti-war movement during World War II said if you're old enough to fight, then you'd be old enough to vote. But would that include if you're old enough to drive, then you're old enough to vote? It doesn't seem logical enough. Because I guess if you're risking your life fighting, is that the same as risking your life driving?
It could be the same.
I'm actually going to go ahead and disagree with my colleagues, particularly in the context of the Argentinian system. What we have to look at in that case is not only did they extend the right to vote to 16-year-olds, but they also got rid of the compulsory voting, and I think that's the key issue here. Once they got rid of the requirement to vote, the people who would ultimately be voting at 16 are more likely to be the informed 16-year-olds. You know, the nerd kids who are sitting there watching debate and speeches all the time. No resemblance to self. But I think you would essentially be left with people who would be just as informed as if you had waited an extra 2 years.
Is it too easy to vote or too hard to vote?
It really depends on where you are. Because voting rights and the way that voting is handled are different in so many different states. I mean, if I'm in, say, Pennsylvania or Alabama, who had the voter ID laws, my ability to vote would be, hindered, rather than if I was in a state that did not have those laws, and it was far easier to register and ultimately cast my ballot.
I think another aspect of it is the ballot. And I didn't personally vote this election, but I remember Lindsay Hand was talking about it, and she said there was just so many names, and she tried to look some of them up, but she didn't even know anyone. So I could see that being a hard factor of it.
Should there be an intelligence test to vote?
I'd say not necessarily an intelligence test, just an awareness test, because up to the election, there were people, I believe the top search term on Google was, who is running for president this year? And it's just, I think people need to be aware of what the issues are, but that doesn't necessarily mean they have to be wholly informed.
Having an intelligence test really just parallels a literacy test. What else was it? It was, can you read well enough to take this ballot? There's not really a difference between can you read and can you know the issues. So in order for us to really uphold everyone's right to vote, like an informed voter is nice, but testing them is just ridiculous.
I could see testing them if it was about the political issues at hand or about the political system. So I'm gonna have to disagree with you guys.
I'd have to disagree with my colleague just now. Like Amanda said, an intelligence test would be similar to the literacy test. It might persuade people not to vote because maybe they don't think they could pass that test. Or even if they don't pass that test, then does that mean they can't vote at all? That would be controversial to many citizens.
Awesome, we'll stop there. Keegan, you go first?